It's a real pleasure having you. You know, this conference started out as a meeting of musicians and technologists, it was focused first on classical music. We have broadened it, but I'm so excited to have with you someone who is really active in classical music, but also is you know, thinking about incorporating innovation into her work quite a bit. You started out as a fantastic violinist. You played music of Tandun. You have your own music festival. Tell us a little bit about how, because when we talked about what would be the title of this panel, you immediately said, I want this to be about how innovation can be the catalyst for cultural institutions and culture. I love that, of course, and this is the crowd that really loves that. Where does your work as a violinist and innovation, how do they intersect? Tell our audience.
So first of all, I think, you know, the biggest part of technology and the way we use it today is that it is our biggest communication tool, obviously. What we are trying to do in many ways, and if you also look a little bit back in history, you can see that some of the biggest innovations that was made, if you look back to, for instance, 1910, 1920, where you have a big breakthrough in, for instance, how their filmmaking, photography, all of these things, they came out from a very artistic standpoint. It was developed because of the artistic content that needed to come out from it. And that in a way is many ways how I also very much think of music, that, you know, we need to have a very clear feeling and need to express ourselves. And of course, that's also where technology comes in very handy. For instance, today, when we musicians are able to have communication with people from around all over the world, just quite simply by you know, either using YouTube or Spotify, whatever it might be. I do also think that, of course, we also need to be able to create these platforms where we can also ask questions of how can we further drive tech innovation from an artistic standpoint. That's also one of the reasons, as you spoke about, also that I have a festival in Oslo. And in Oslo, we have we are building up now the Oslo International Arts Festival, and a big part of the festival is going to take part a summit. And in that summit, we have quite a big focus on tech, amongst other things. Also, I'm very lucky to have a strong board where one of the founders of Tencent is on board as well. And it just shows me that, you know, regardless of almost anything, we really need to be able to kind of define and help explore how we can use technology for the sake of music.
And you mentioned the new festival that you are planning. When is the first iteration of the festival going to happen?
So, well, nowadays things are changing quite a bit, I must say, but the original plan was to do it in March 21. Right now we are actually just discussing whether we should do a smaller version of it, because I do think that particularly now, you can see everyone being very creative from their homes, making home concerts, using the vessels they can in order to still communicate and bring music out to people. So in many ways, I do think it is important to be able to continue and make sure there is content out there that we continue to push and get things out. But we just have to see it. Right now, it's a little bit difficult. But for sure, March 22, we will be up and running full scale.
That's great. Well, you know, recently I was very happy that the Karajan Institute and you worked together on a new TV channel that was started by Deutsche Telekom. It's called #dabei. Which, how do you translate that? It means #together, I guess. The idea was precisely as you said, create music from the home of a musician to the homes of others. We said in the partnership with Deutsche Telekom, well, let's work together on bringing our Karajan fellows and musicians from our network onto that program. Would you like to share a little bit on how you actually, did the production for that, how it all came together? Because it was really done in matter of days. It could even say matter of hours, right?
Exactly. No, I mean, first of all, it's such a nice opportunity in many ways to be able to take part in creating something with a different audience in mind, so to speak, and on a new channel. That's very exciting. So what we did was it was taking place in my living room at home because I was in quarantine and not allowed to go out. And then we just had some cameras set up, and it was really meant to be like as if it would be a live performance. So there were no breaks. They were just me playing and doing the moderation, of course, in between and telling what was going on. But it is a very interesting experience to play to. Obviously, you play to a camera. You know, there is hopefully a lot of people watching it, but not to have that instant feeling and connection with your audience. It's a very new situation, and it's a very different way of communicating, and you're really dependent on being able to still keep that energy and that kind of love for the music and to translate that through the camera. It's very interesting. It's a new experience in many ways, not have any audience. I mean,
yeah, well, it's as a musician, do you miss the interaction with the audience in the room? Is it a different mode of making music? Can you describe this a little bit more, perhaps?
Yes, it is. For me, it is a very, very big difference, and it's something about when you have you can connect emotionally, and not to mention also to a certain way physically when you have people right in front of you when you play for them, because you can. There's something about that energy it gives. It's something about feeling and sensing kind of where you have your audience, as opposed to when you only play to a camera. Obviously, you don't get any of that. But what is fascinating in hindsight, for instance, a few weeks ago, I also did one of these streaming concerts, and when we saw there were, I think, 30,000 views of just that little concert, it feels very bizarre when you're just yourself and with a camera, and then at the same time you have such an outreach. It's a very it gets more personal in many ways, but it does require a little bit of extra. Imagine when you give everything into a piece and you hopefully play with your heart and you give a lot of emotions, and then you finish with the last note, and then there's like not really any response. That part is nothing, and it's just a different mindset, because I think we musicians, we really thrive of having that response and having that connection, immediate connection, whether it's for 2 people or 100 or 100,000, doesn't really matter, but it's just that kind of human contact. That's definitely a big change.
Well, you mentioned the word connection, and I think this is precisely what music is doing instantly, right? You play a note, and through the hearing of the audience, you have an immediate emotional connection. And of course, that is a different thing over a network. Do you think that through this crisis, where everyone is now using these networks quite a bit and in different ways, we see how to improve perhaps some of this technology to make it more, usable for musicians? Is there a wish list you would have for technologists of Zoom, Deutsche Telekom, other companies, from a musician standpoint? Now is the time to share it.
Well, now's the time to give a wish list. Oh, perfect. Well, one thing I'm of course become extremely aware of is that even though as good, I mean, I can't really say that I have the access to the best technical equipment, but what we do have, whether it's phones or cameras or like a bit more professional setting, it is of course a very big challenge to transform the sound you hear live through through any kind of technological vessel. I mean, of course you can create as close to it as possible, but to have that kind of surround, that intensity, that kind of rawness in sound, which has not been filtered in any way, that would be my wish in many ways, to be able to get as close to a live and a kind of acoustic kind of sound as possible. And I know people work on it, and I know there are some excellent examples of it, but it really, when I see and hear and also do these home concerts myself in particular, then you really see that the quality is quite different, and then I sometimes feel like you don't get the best you possibly could if it was just being there in person.
Mhm. Yeah, it's kind of interesting when you look at the history of technology and music. Of course,
Yeah.
what comes to mind is the CD format, which was championed also by Herbert von Karajan. And
Yes.
when you read the newspaper articles at the time, you often see that people said like, "Yeah, but digital sound, it's not the real thing. There is sort of an alienation between," and still some people make that argument, but. Karajan had this really interesting answer, and that was, well, if you think about it, even writing down music and performing from written notation is already an alienation from the ideas and emotions that the composer had. And so you could look at various technologies, and it will always, have this sort of degrees of separation from the original thought, but it works nevertheless. It's kind of funny, isn't it?
Absolutely. And you can see a lot of composers also who take this very much into action. I mean, one I can mention because I know him very well is Tandun, for instance. I mean, for instance, he has a cell phone concerto, amongst other things. And where you can say, of course, I mean, the sound is, of course, very different than what you would play if you just played the notes, but it doesn't mean that it's any less worthy to listen to him anyways, And it's just fascinating to use what we can and what we have accessible for us, that kind of technique, and kind of to communicate the music in a different way and make it more either accessible or just in a different setting. And I think that's very exciting.
So on the other stage, the evolution stage, in the morning, we had a few talks on how to actually either completely rethink musical instruments or, enhance them with technology. How do you feel about that? Is this something where you say, oh, that's really cool, I would like to try it out? Or is your connection with the instrument maybe very emotional and intimate, and you don't want any technology in the way there? What's your thought on this?
Well, first of all, I can say that I play on a violin from 1754, so technology has not quite catched up with me there. But for me, what is so special about being able to play that kind of historic instruments is exactly, as you mentioned, there's such an emotional connection to the sound. In many ways, is what I feel like it's my voice. And there's something about, there's a particular word that I think kind of describes it the most, and that's a certain soul. There's a certain feeling and a certain, it's almost difficult to describe actually, but there's something that I have not quite been able to connect the same way as with very, not modern instruments, but let's say like electronic violin, all this kind of stuff. It's very different, and you play differently also, I think. There's a different, I mean, not necessarily technique, but it's for a different use, I find.
But wouldn't you sometimes wish that the instrument that you play would be, maybe slightly different in one or two aspects to better maybe fit your fingers, your hand? Is this something that has never been a problem for you, or do you just, overcome it by practicing and just getting used to the instrument?
I think for us classical musicians, it is more than anything, you're trying to get close to a certain ideal, a certain, it can be a certain way of playing or certain techniques, but what we really spend, I think, most of our time on is actually just getting close, as close as we can to that sort of perfectionism. And in most cases, that means an ideal that is not so much to do per se with kind of technical solutions, I would say, but more to do with how to protect sound. And keep in mind our instruments. I mean, the violin it's wood. You have the bow where you have horsehair. Like nothing has changed there. Also in a good 300 years. But of course, I do think it's interesting to experiment, and I do think that's important to do also in order to kind of drive also the music part further. It's a lot of talk of how technology, it's a very, natural question to ask, how to develop technology further. We don't really necessarily talk that much about from the music side. I mean, there are certain periods where you have very, very distinct different expressions and very distinct different ways of how you want things to sound. I mean, just look at, for instance, going from Baroque to classicism to romanticism to now modern. I mean, that's also a big question of how can we then use music and also to combine better with technology and the development further.
So you play a lot of contemporary music. You mentioned Tandun. Is this something that you always did? Where does this come from? Is this something that you learned later on? Let's talk a little bit about that topic of innovation of the music itself.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, I think it's fantastically interesting to be able to work with the living composers, because, you know, most of the repertoire you play as a classical musician are, you know, from very set periods where the composer is no longer around. So that, I would say, maybe is first of all where my curiosity comes from, is to be able to work with someone and know what they actually intended with the music. But then secondly, I do think it's important to take part in and try to take part in the development of where music goes further. What is the direction? What do we want with it? And especially also the whole experimentation with it. And that's something I learned a lot with working with Tandun, for instance. He's very, very open-minded to what kind of elements he puts into music, whether it is whether it is very standard elements like water, fire, wind, these kind of things, or more on the more electronic side. Or, for instance, when he wrote the violin concerto for me called Fire Ritual, which is a really fantastic piece. But part of it, when we worked this piece together, one part of it in the music, he turned over to me and said, you know, in this place you really need to sound like Jimi Hendrix. This is your sound goal, you know. So you really need to be able to. Did you know
what Jimi Hendrix sounded like, or did you have to go back and study that first?
No, I had to check it a little bit, I have to say, but I understood what he meant, like this kind of like electrifying energy that you kind of, and the sound is a bit more, you know, slimmer, sharper, a bit more like just kind of more singy than the worms usually play on the violin, for instance, you know. So those things are also very interesting to explore, because it does also affect how you know, just how you interpret and play certain things. But then you also need to know the references, obviously.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's kind of interesting when you look at an artist like Karajan, and I bring him in always because he was such a visionary and innovative person. He never said, I'm a conductor of classical music. He never said, I'm a classical musician. He would always just refer to him as a musician and, you know, as the music he's playing. And I think that is something to reflect on and to keep in mind, that, you know, in the end of the day, it is very, very rare that someone only listens to music of a certain period, right? Most of the people that I interact with listen to all sorts of music, including myself. And I presume you as well, right?
Absolutely. And I think one thing that has really changed over the years, and actually, funny enough, even though you can say, I mean, I listen a lot to playlists, for instance, where a lot of the fun is just that you don't know what's coming next, and you have one movement of something, or then maybe a completely different genre, different expression. But that's kind of also, I think, something that is very exciting. Also, you need to be able to connect with the world around you, and also to connect with how people express themselves. And for many people that is through, you know, music in general, but maybe also through the arts, and being able to take in all these different expressions and not get too blinded to being, you know, being stuck in one little box. That's something I think is very important, and that's also why it is important to work with contemporary composers or listen to different music, all of these things, because you need to challenge yourself in how you're thinking, first of all, but also how to express it, which in my case is on the violin, you know.
So you talked a lot about, you know, your relationship with contemporary music, other musics, the audience. We talked about your festival that you are creating, that you have been creating, and the new idea that is coming up. One thing we haven't talked about is sort of the actual place where people make music, the concert hall, the cultural institution as a physical place. Do you have any ideas or wish lists on how the physical place could maybe be a little bit different, and how would your ideal concert hall look like?
Oh, ideal concert hall. I do think there is one pretty ideal one, though, which is in Berlin. This one I think is fantastic, in the Philharmonie. I mean, in general, what I think is the most important when you play in a big concert hall is actually to have this feeling that you can somehow communicate with everyone. So, for instance, having people around you, being able to find a way to. I mean, of course, mostly when you play, you're speaking without words, but that means you just need to communicate in a different way, and being able to have people get close to you without necessarily having the physical closeness. It's something I think is incredibly fascinating when you play concerts. It's just what kind of references people have afterwards. I mean, you can have everything from the emotional connections you can make with music. I think it's just absolutely fantastic, and that's one of the reasons I think also why I love it so much. But for me, it's not so much about whether there's 2 people or 100 people, just as long as you can just play to someone, and that's also why it's been very fascinating to try out now in these quarantine times when people cannot go to the big concert hall. And just I saw also quite a few people made a remark saying that, a lot of the time, part of going to the concert hall is being, you dress up, the costume, how to behave, all that stuff. And for many people, it became a bit of a very, very different experience being able to sit home and, sit in your pajama or whatever and still follow.
Dressed up from the waist.
Yeah, exactly. But still, you can still follow, and have quite a different musical experience because you are somehow maybe a little bit different tuned into and focusing in a different way. So it's just interesting to see how people react to that versus actually being in a hall. And at the same time, I have to say I love being in halls and listening to concert too, because it's part of that kind of atmosphere and energy, and even such a small things like hearing the performer breathe, and that it doesn't have to be like a so-called perfect performance or anything like this, but it has to be, you have to connect the emotional side.
Yeah, I think this element of being in the vicinity of the performer is, of course, an amazing experience. And whoever had the chance to be very close to the performer, will also appreciate what you just said about the breathing. I think this is one of the things that we are missing in a lot of the, televised and broadcast performances, because they are so perfect. They are missing some of that imperfection that makes it human. Now, I see that in the chats, a lot of discussion has been going on about, are there any scientific studies of emotion via, broadcast and so on. I just want to ask the audience to think about questions for our guest and write them in the channel or raise your hand, wave to us, and we can let you ask your question with your voice. While we wait for the audience to engage, I wanted to come back to your new festival idea for next year. Can you share a little bit more about that, or is this too early for you to maybe highlight some of the new formats that you're talking about, that you're envisioning? What's going to be happening there?
So one of the main ideas for creating a new festival, it's quite a few, although a few reasons. As a traveling musician, I feel super lucky to be able to travel the world. And on my travels in various countries, I met so many fantastic people who are not in the music business per se, but who are, either in tech or business or innovation, anything of those. And we all connect through music, basically. And that kind of gave me the quite a big push to see that, such an what a fantastic vessel music is in order to, first of all, communicate, but also it is a big umbrella where you can have those conversations and meet people across all those sectors, which maybe normally will not have naturally met up. And I wanted to bring them all to Oslo, to Norway, a country that I've been away from for 10 years. I just moved back to Norway And I think Norway is such a fantastic place to start and hopefully bring it back to being a new kind of cultural hub. And I think it is something that I see a lot of my colleagues, and we also discuss this quite a lot, is that, you know, we have to, it is quite easy to just bury your head a bit in the sand and only focus on music and playing and it, because it is very, you know, it's a very perfectionistic kind of thing we're trying to do. But at the same time, it's so important that we have to look into all these other sectors and show and really make sure that music is really the core of, also it should be a big core of society. And it is in many, many ways, but I think particularly now we can see that people are really appreciating what the arts really does for you. You know, it connects your emotional levels, your intellectual, everything all in one big package. So the idea of the festival is that I really wanted to have a platform where particularly, you know, arts and culture is the big umbrella where all these people can meet, but also it's interesting to see people who are really successful in their fields, how they also have a big link to particularly music and the arts. And that gives a big room for discussions, and also how innovation can be tied into that and how to push that further.
Right. So it's about the community. It's about being a festival, being more than a series of concerts. It's rather a place where you can actually discuss, experience, and really form communities that will then have an impact.
Yes, and also really show that this is actually something that's very vital for us. It's not just, you know, like a luxury thing that's put on top, which can easily go if things are tougher. I mean, like for instance now, to use that as an example, I think it's, and I'm very happy to see this, that it really is now that people can, you know, imagine your days now without books, you know, even television, music, anything, you know, that would have been made us very shallow people, I think. So I'm very happy to see that, you know, it is a vital part of our society, and that's also why we need to make sure and have this platform.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be talking to you. The time flies by, and we are already, you know, 2 minutes before the next panel starts. I see quite a bit of chat going on in our Zoom call, and also outside in the social media world. But I don't see a concrete question. I think everyone is pondering about what they just heard, and I'm sure that they will reach out to you when this session ends. I want to take the time to really thank you for what you're doing outside of our little community, but also that you're part of what we're doing here in the Karajan community. And I'm pretty sure that this was not the last time we worked together. And so I wish you all the best for what's coming up. And thank you again, Eldbjørg.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure, and I'm really, really honored to be part of the Karajan community. So thank you so much.